work, they begin to pay taxes. Our $2.2 trillion begins to increase, but as every single individual is hired, they come off welfare, unemployment, and food stamps, and then they go down into the productive part of society, so we find our economic imbalance collapsing toward itself. The costs collapse as we are hiring people and putting them back to work, and that should have been the concentration of President Obama's speech today. In the past, because of our policies, we've lost the producers in this country, a list of them: Fender Guitars, Converse, Etch-a-Sketch, Radio Flyer, Levi's, Craftsman Tools, Stanley Tools, USA Flags, Rawlings Baseballs, Brock's Candy, IBM Computers, NBA Uniforms. These are just a partial list of companies that have decided that it's cheaper to manufacture somewhere else because our policies make it too difficult. If we're going to rebuild our economy, we need to rebuild that manufacturing base, and we do that through tax policy. That should be the concentration of both parties at this time in our nation's history. Now, the President also mentions on page 2 that we're amassing an alarming debt levels back in the 1980s. If I look at my chart, again, I show our deficits. This year our deficit is $1.3 trillion. That is, our spending exceeds the revenues by $1.3 trillion. That deficit runs over, and I show it going into our debt barrel, that accumulated debt for generations past. You know, Mr. Obama mentions adequately that that debt in the 80s started reaching alarming levels. But from the time of George Washington until the first President Bush, that's after 1980, we had an accumulation of about $5 trillion worth of debt. If you look at the chart, you can see that we have an accumulation today of almost $15 trillion. So we had $5 trillion back in the mid-80s, and now we're at $15 trillion. I would point out to the President, when he says we were amassing debt at alarming levels in the 1980s, that the debt he has accumulated in his presidency is almost equivalent to what we accumulated from the time of George Washington to the first President Bush. That is alarming. It's an alarming statistic that we have a deficit today in this budget of $1.3 trillion, but in 2007, the last budget written under a Republican Congress and with President Bush as president, the last deficit was under $200 billion. That would be the equivalent to 0.2. So today we're over $1.1 trillion, and even up into when the president came into office, our annual deficit was less than $500 million. So we have now, $500 billion. We now have over $1.5 trillion that the president is suggesting our debt level should be next year. So in his time alone, we've increased deficits from the billion-dollar category, increased them to the trillion-dollar category, and that is alarming debt. That is what has got other nations pointing to us and saying that's not sustainable. They're afraid when they loan us money that it's not going to be paid back. And so nations are increasingly reticent to lend us money. That then results in the Federal Reserve buying most of our debt. This year, our Federal Reserve is on track. Now keep in mind, they get much of their money from the government, and then they're loaning us money from the other hand. Our Federal Reserve this year is on track to lend us about 60 to 70% of the money that we borrow. Now, Mr. Bernanke expresses deep belief that there are buyers for those Treasury bills out there. There are people who are going to lend our nation money. But as they look at the economic instability that we're facing, they understand the need that we have to, number one, correct spending, but number two, to grow the economy and create jobs. Now, there are those skeptics who do not believe that tax cuts will create jobs. Again, I follow the example of Exxon. When you take their profits away, you tax them more, then you actually decrease the amount that they're spending with drilling companies, offshore platforms, that they're spending in different communities to get services done to their wells as they drill them. Also, I would remind the listeners today of Mr. Sweat, that $340,000 for the bulldozer. Those are the evidences that we get that tax cuts will create jobs. But if we want to look at the other model, tax increases killing jobs, we can look no further than our own country. At the time of the tax cuts of 2003, over the next 4 to 5 years, our economy created over 5 million jobs. As the threat of taxes loomed, as the economic slowdown came in, as the uncertainty of the current administration began to take hold, then we have lost almost 3 million jobs. And so just the talk of taxes, the talk of the cap and trade tax, permeated the discussions in 2009. It began to cause people to shy away and say, we better not invest because we're afraid we're going to be taxed. The discussions of the health care bill also related to the belief that the people had that Washington was going to raise taxes in the health care field. And so again, consumers began not to purchase as much. Investors began not to buy new equipment. People everywhere were becoming more cautious, and we slipped into stagnation. Our economy began to stagnate and lose jobs, and has not yet been creating those jobs at any significant rate. We're still above 8% unemployment, and that was to be the floor we would find if we spent the money on the stimulus in a previous vision that the Obama administration gave to us. So as we think about other examples, I always like to use the example of Ireland. 15 or 20 years ago, Ireland began to lower its corporate tax rates. They believed, as I'm saying tonight, that if they would lower tax rates to corporations, that the companies would actually come flooding into the country. They would come there to produce. And it created the Irish miracle, the economic miracle of growth that was caused by Ireland cutting its corporate tax rate from about 36% down to around 12%. A significant decrease. Companies began to flood into Ireland. The contrast is also given by Ireland. As they began to find prosperity, they began to spend more than they bring in. This same model that we're looking at here, they began to raise taxes, and now then corporations are flooding away. Just today, I was visiting with the managers of a cheese plant that is on the east side of New Mexico. They're an Irish company. They've come here to produce because it's just too difficult, too high. The taxes are too great in Ireland. My brother-in-law works for Hughes Tool. He was at Hughes Tool back when they moved factories, production facilities into Ireland. This year, my brother-in-law went to disassemble the last plant in Ireland because they had gone up on their tax rates and no longer was it a good place to operate. So if we're interested in solving the economic chaos that we're facing, we can't get there simply by spending cuts. We can't get there by taxing the rich. In other words, taxing the rich is going to drive us further away from the goal, further into stagnation, further into job losses. If we're going to rebuild our economy, we must concentrate on economic growth. And the nice thing is that the actuarial tables tell us that if we will grow jobs at about 3.5%, that this imbalance begins to disappear, that the worry of the future begins to dissipate, simply because we grow the economy, we create jobs, we take people off of unemployment, we take people off of welfare, off of food stamps, our 3.5 cost to the government begins to diminish, the 2.2 begins to grow, and we find ourselves reaching balance. And over the long term, we find ourselves beginning to reduce this $15 trillion debt. We find ourselves able to sustain the $202 trillion worth of unplanned expenses. Excuse me, they're not unplanned, they're simply unpaid for. The expenses of Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. That's where the real threat lies. And nowhere in Mr. Obama's plan did I see a dealing with those significant drains on our economy. His only plan is to tax the rich, the millionaires and the billionaires, by making them pay their fair share. And that, he says, is going to fix the economy. That, my friends, is going to wreck the economy. When we choose that course of making the rich pay more than their fair share, they owe it to us. It's only fair, he says in his speech, that they would pay a little more. When we do that, we're going to choke jobs off even more. Other nations, our 2.2 is going to be less. We're going to put those people out of work, just like we did offshore in Louisiana. We put about 100,000 people out of work there. We put them out, or we're on the way to putting them out of work. Those people, instead of paying taxes, are going to pay no taxes, but they're now going to cost us unemployment benefits. They're going to cost us in Medicare, Medicaid. They're going to cost us in food stamps, welfare, and they're not going to be producing. So with this vision of taxing the rich, we're going to move more to an unproductive society, because you cannot create more productivity by taxing it. If that were the case, every nation would be productive. Every nation can always go up on taxes, but not every nation can create the environment to where innovators are allowed to produce. The innovations in the oil and gas industry have been dramatic, and yet that's the single area it appears that President Obama is going to kill first. That whole specter he refers to as yesterday's fuel, yesterday's energy. If it is yesterday's energy, let the president take the lead and cease using it. Use the energies of tomorrow. Stop using that energy of the past. Let him fly an airplane on something besides jet fuel, please. Give us that bold vision and courage and leadership. Let him show us the way. If fossil fuels are a thing of the past. But I suspect, like you and me, that the president is going to continue to drive his limousine on petroleum-based products. He's going to continue to fly Air Force One, not on solar power, but on jet fuel. I suspect that all of Americans are going to do it. The only thing that we're going to have as an outcome is less plentiful energy, fewer jobs, a greater imbalance in our government spending, greater uncertainty for the future. And that's a shame that that's the leadership that we're getting. Because at this point in our world's history, it would be possible, if we are literally looking to recreate our economy, to draw back the manufacturing jobs of the past, to put them back to work here, to rekindle the industries that are gone, so that we do have a bright future, so that people have not just jobs, but careers to face, that they're able to plan for their future, that they're able to save for a house, save for the kids' education, that they're able truly to live the American dream. That's what has made this country great in the past. And I think that Americans at this point in time will find that leadership to the future. And with that, I yield back my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields back his time. Does the gentleman have a motion?
Yes, I would move that we adjourn for the day.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye.